All right, we have a few minutes left, so I have one last question for the both of you. What are the major risks that you're looking out for today? We're already living through the worst pandemic in recent history. We're seeing a recession that some analysts would say is even worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. And in response, we're seeing monetary stimulus on a historic level. Jim, let's start with you. How could things possibly get worse from here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I encourage everyone to stop using the word monetary stimulus. There is no monetary stimulus. There is money printing. Yes, there is money printing and debt monetization, but it has no stimulative effect. You don't get inflation from printing money. You get it from velocity, which is psychological, which the Fed doesn't understand. But the biggest threat is deflation.
Peter, you've argued that we could see inflation as a tax. So how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, the only thing you're going to see deflation measured in is gold. But in terms of fiat currency, prices are going to go up dramatically because they will continue to print the dollar until it no longer has value. That's the only thing that's going to stop it. But look, what we've seen so far, even with the civil unrest and the riots and the looting, this is just a small dress rehearsal for what's coming. Because when the dollar crashes, and prices skyrocket, right? These stimulus checks, or whatever welfare benefits the government wants to dispense, they're not going to be worth very much. I mean, because you're not going to be able to buy anything. And I think the government is going to respond to the surge in consumer prices with price controls, kind of the way we did in the 1970s. But prices are going to be rising much faster now than they did back then. But I think there's going to be controls on all sorts of consumer goods, and that means shortages. That means long lines. And I think there's going to be power rationing. And so I think you're going to see a real blow up, particularly in the cities. There's going to be a lot of crime, a lot of violence associated with widespread shortages and a lack of food and power outages. So things are going to get pretty bad as we go through a monetary crisis. It's not, this is not just a financial crisis. This is a U.S. dollar crisis and a sovereign debt crisis. That's a whole nother ballgame.
Jim, I'll let you respond and close the argument.
Yeah, well, I agree with Peter that the Fed wants inflation, but they don't know how to get it. And they haven't for the last 12 years.
Well, that's the one thing they do know how to do. They can cause inflation. That's all they can do. They can print money.
No, they can't. They can't, Peter. They printed $7 trillion in 12 years and we got no inflation. Assets, yes, but I'm talking about.
I mean, prices are higher than they were 7 years ago, consumer prices, but we inflated a stock market bubble. We inflated a real estate bubble. We inflated a bond market bubble. I mean, asset prices went way up. We distorted the economy based on all that inflation. And look, consumer prices have risen, right? I mean, I don't care the way the government wants to keep track of them with their, with the CPI. The CPI is not an accurate reflection of what's actually happening with consumer prices.
It's pretty good. Look, if you want to count assets, you're right, but you're changing it's moving the goalpost. You're changing the definition.
No.
If you count assets, yes, but I count consumer prices or PCE core deflator because that's how. If you want to predict Fed policy, that's what they look at. So you need to consider.
I don't care what the Fed looks at. I care about reality. And prices are going up, but that's not inflation. Because if the Fed didn't create all this inflation, maybe those prices would have really come down. Maybe consumers would have gotten the benefit of a lower cost of living. But the Fed stole that benefit away from them by creating inflation. But look, all of this inflation is going to come home to roost. All of a sudden, we're going to catch up and we're going to see dramatic increases in consumer prices. And then when you go back over the entire period, you can say, oh, look, prices are up 10% a year or whatever they're going to be, because all of a sudden they're going to shoot way up. And it's not going to matter that they were benign for a while when all of a sudden they skyrocket and catch up to where they should have been. But the cause was all the inflation the Federal Reserve has been creating the entire time.
Well, I agree that if the Fed didn't do what they did, we would have had more deflation. And in a way, they were just fighting it to a standstill. But we haven't had inflation for 12 years. Asset prices, yes, but that's not the definition of inflation.
The definition of inflation is an expansion of the supply of money. And that's what we've had in spades. This is the greatest inflation that the world has ever experienced.
You can make up your own definitions, Peter. The definition of inflation is higher prices.
Jim, I'm not making up the definition. It's people today. You go back and get a Webster dictionary from 100 years ago, and you read what inflation is, and it'll say inflation is an expansion of the money supply of money and credit. Rising prices are an effect of inflation, right? Prices don't inflate. Prices go up and they go down. Money supply inflates. Inflate is to expand, right? You don't expand prices. What is being expanded is a supply of money. That's inflation. Inflation is an expansion of the money supply. Deflation is a contraction of the money supply. The effects of inflation and deflation are on prices. When you have inflation and you're inflating the money supply, prices will go up. And when you're deflating it, prices will go down. But sometimes you can inflate the money supply and prices don't go up because the inflation is preventing prices from going down. But don't confuse changes in prices with changes in money supply. Money supply is inflation. Prices are just prices.
The problem, Peter, look, we're talking past each other because we have two different definitions. If you say that prices are flat, but that's inflation, fine. That's not how any central bank in the world or any economist thinks about it.
The central bankers want to pretend that inflation has to do with prices because they don't want to be blamed for it. When you accept the real definition of inflation, which is an expansion of the money supply, then you know who causes it. It's government. It's central banks that cause inflation. But governments want to blame inflation on the private sector. That's why they want to redefine it as prices. And you're playing into their propaganda by trying to perpetuate the idea that inflation is caused by greedy businessmen raising their prices or labor unions or speculators.
Now you're way over the line because
you're saying inflation is prices going up.
You're putting words in my mouth that I never said. I said that inflation is measured by prices. That's just how you do it. If you have a different definition, that's fine.
No, inflation is measured by the money supply.
Thank you very much, Jim Rickards and Peter Schiff, for being on the show. It's a tremendous honor once again to have both of you, so I do appreciate it. And if you haven't watched parts 1 and 2 of this panel interview, the links are down below. Thanks for watching until the very end. I'm David Lin of Kitco News. Stay tuned.